We are now going to hear from Ms. Anjali Thakur-Mithil. She's the Deputy Director of Field Operations and Director of the Americans for a Fair Chance project for the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights and the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights Education Fund. Without further ado, Ms. Do I do both names together?
Yes.
Yes, I do. Thakur-Mithil. No, it's important. That's your name, and that's what we'll do.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, I just officially changed it about a week ago, so I'm still getting used to it. So before I begin, I'd like to first thank the association and President Gregory Chambers and Executive Director Shirley Wilcher for the invitation to join you all here today. I think this is my third opportunity to speak with you, and I always enjoy our discussions. And again, in particular, I want to thank you for your commitment to this work and the work that you do daily. It's so important. By way of background, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights is a coalition that's charged by its diverse membership of more than 200 national organizations, including the Association for Affirmative Action, to promote and protect the civil and human rights of all persons in the U.S. We do this through advocacy and targeted outreach to particular constituencies. The Leadership Conference Education Fund is our education and research arm for the coalition. And we work on educating and building the public will for policies that promote civil and human rights for all. I, in particular, direct the Americans for a Fair Chance project, which seeks to preserve and advance equal opportunity at the state and national levels. We support equal opportunity for communities because they need it, and because when communities prosper, we know we all benefit. We're in favor of initiatives that make it possible for all communities to succeed by giving them a hand up and not a hand out. I know each of us on this panel is representing a different perspective. I believe that I've been invited in particular to provide perspective and insight on the climate around equal opportunity and tools such as affirmative action as it relates to the state level. Through the Americans for a Fair Chance project I mentioned, we have been the coordinating entity for a collaborative and broad set of strategies that are implemented by allied organizations that are primarily focused on preserving and advancing equal opportunity at the state level. I'm going to apologize now for having to leave a few minutes early to catch my train back to DC, but I did leave my card and some brochures by the registration desk. If anyone has any questions that I'm not able to answer, I'm happy to follow up with you all afterwards. Thanks.
Thank you so very much. All right, so Mr. Parker is the Executive Director of the Beyond Diversity Resource Center and a diversity consultant who has built his reputation on a personal commitment to shape diversity initiatives for individuals and communities. Sir?
Thank you very much. And I'd like to say thank you for having me at this really important conference, for this really important conversation. I'm wondering who the extreme liberal was that you mentioned. I'm not quite sure whether I'm that person or whether it was someone else on the panel.
Might be Mr. Armstrong.
Right.
He said definitely not.
Okay. But I am an attorney, which I guess gives me either a leg up or a leg down, depending upon what your perspective is. What we do at the Beyond Diversity Resource Center is primarily educate. And I was particularly interested in the panel discussion today because it has so much to do with understanding where we are around some very key sociological issues. The panel, as I was informed, was about talking in some very serious ways about the difference between affirmative action and diversity. What do the two mean, and how are they situated? You know, what does it mean to be an affirmative action officer, for example, versus an officer that's charged with diversity and inclusion? Is there a difference? Should there be a difference? And what's happening? One of the things that I do in my work is go to conferences all the time, and I'm often a facilitator, especially for people who are affirmative action officers, people of color who are affirmative action officers, people who are diversity officers. And one of the things that I noticed roundly, especially when those people are in caucuses, is that they are absolutely exhausted. They are just so tired, on and on and on. I see a lot of heads nodding and saying, yes, we sure are. And I'd like to approach that issue by having a firm sociological context for what I see as the differences between affirmative action and diversity, to sort of explain, explain that fatigue which so often arises. As I think of affirmative action, I think of those policies and procedures grounded in law that say we need to do something affirmative to level the playing field, to make sure that there's equal opportunity. It certainly includes enforcing laws like Title VII. It also includes taking other affirmative steps to make sure that we reach out to people, especially folks who are from marginalized groups, to make sure that they have an opportunity. Diversity, on the other hand, in my experience, means almost anything that people wish it to mean. It can mean everything from celebrating the heroes and holidays, excuse me. When you're liberal, you lose your voice every now and then. It can mean everything from heroes and holidays to cultural competency to what we do mostly, which is anti-racism work. And so as I begin to think about why it's so difficult to be an affirmative action officer or to work in affirmative action, I think it's worthy to take into account this really important idea. I think that affirmative action is becoming, unfortunately, less popular. That is, the work of leveling the playing field, of telling people you need to do better, is becoming less and less popular because it strikes at four key values, four key things that Americans feel about themselves, and four key things that I think Americans wrongly feel about themselves. And these were described by Eduardo Bonilla Silver in his book, Racism Without Racists. He calls them fields, if you will. I think of them as narratives or deeply held societal values. And I just want to touch on the four of them really briefly so that perhaps we can talk about them a little bit more. The first one, the first closely held value, is the lack of any vision about how racial and other disparities affect people in their everyday lives. That is, that if you ask most Americans, they will say, well, race really doesn't matter that much anymore. And so if you bring up things like how employment, incarceration, how long you're going to live, where you can live, if you're going to live, is affected by things like race and other differences, it will be minimized. Oh, that really doesn't matter. It used to matter, not so much anymore. Second firmly held belief in American culture is that to the extent that those differences are there, that they are the product of a broken culture. That is that, well, to the extent that the incarceration rate, for example, for African American males over 18 is 7 times the rate for white males, it's because they come from, quote unquote, a broken culture. They're more violent, they're less educated, they care less, and therefore they get what they deserve. The third thing is that, well, the idea that prejudice is always going to be with us. And so to the extent that there's racism, sexism, and homophobia, I'll often hear people say, well, you know, there's always going to be some kind of prejudice. You know, it's just human nature. And so the idea is that, well, we're sort of stuck with a certain level of badness that we have to tolerate in any society. And the fourth thing that I think affirmative action strikes at is the idea that America is primarily a meritocracy. That is, that if I rise or fall, it's because of the power of my own intellect and my own goodwill, and has nothing to do with anything like race or color or the amount of money that my parents had or didn't have. to the extent that affirmative action says, well, no, there's something broken in the society that we need to work on, it attacks those fundamental views, and for that reason, I think, has become less and less popular. I also want to quickly point out that I think that that's a good thing. Not that it's becoming less popular, but that it is striking at those fundamental views. And what I hope that we can do during our time together is to talk about, well, what are some of those strategies to begin to change that thinking? Because I ultimately believe that where we are now, in a place where modern racism is much more prevalent than the old style racism was, that we really need to have strategies, not only affirmative action officers, but all of us, so that we can begin to change the thinking. And when we change the thinking, we begin to solve the real problems, which, in my humble view, is how people all across America are oppressed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a lot to chew on.